Awesome. I'm really looking forward to this event. Why? Well, it's close to my heart. Desktop virtualization is truly what I like and what I do for quite a while, and I'm happy to to be part of this awesome event and also an awesome community initiatives. It's not like about me. It's about Helge and Nick, and I'm really pleased that Helge and Nick share their best practices and are on this call as well. And this is a great opportunity for you as well to learn from Helge and from Nick, hopefully for me as well a little bit, but also ask questions to us. I will explain later what the goal of this webinar is. So first, let's Helge introduce himself. Helge, the floor is yours.
Hi, everybody. Yes, some of you may know me as the original architect of the product that is today available as Citrix Profile Management. I'm also very happy about my community awards, the Citrix CTP, the Microsoft MVP, and the VMware vExpert Awards, just like Ruben. So yeah, and today I'm the founder of the company Vast Limits. Our product is called UberAgent, and it's an analytics and monitoring product for end-user computing.
Awesome. Nick, how about you?
Yep, and this is Nick Rintallen here. I'm a lead architect in our consulting organization at Citrix, and I've been with the company for about 12 years now, actually this month, and pretty much been in the field doing consulting the entire time. So
awesome.
Happy to be here today.
Yeah, well, it's as I mentioned earlier, and to mean that is that it is an honor to have you guys on in this call. It is called a webinar because we use this platform, but it's not like a traditional webinar where like a vendor or a couple of vendors share their story, share their insights. It is different, and sometimes I like to be different, and this is also the case with the Ultimate Desktop Virtualization Best Practices Guide. It is really truly a community effort, and we achieved as a community group, we achieved something special. Why? Because we as a community group, we created 224 best practices, and we categorized them in 14 different categories, and these best practices are contributed by 35 different people in the field, like Helge and like Nick and like me as an example. We collected these best practices in this book, like a hard copy. We have some hard copies, and of course the PDF. You will get access to the PDF with a recording, as Michelle mentioned. If you are a user group, a Citrix user group leader or a VMware user group leader, and you want to have access to a couple or a handful of best practices, bucket books, like physical books, to give away or to do something special with that, let me know. Ruben at atlantiscomputing.com. Let me know, and I'm more than happy to send a couple of books to you so you can use them in your user group. This Ultimate Desktop Virtualization Best Practices Guide is truly unique in the desktop virtualization space, and there is more to come as well in this space. So there are ideas, or more than ideas, to do interesting other things with best practices and content. Why this content? Because, well, I truly believe in knowledge sharing. That's what I do in the community for a while, as Helge and as Nick as well, at various events, Briar Forum, Citrix, VMworld, HP, Gartner, all type of events. And, well, it's learning experience as well. It's sharing knowledge, but also learning from Nick, from Helge, and hopefully from you guys as well. Because this webinar is not only about us, but also about you. So if you have best practices you want to share with others, please use the questions and answers option in GoToWebinar, or use the chat option in GoToWebinar. Or if you want to be part of this community effort in the future, we will create new content, new books, other books. Let me know as well. Happy to give you some insights, what the benefits are, what we expect. And it's not tons of work. I think Helge mentioned it earlier in the prep call, that what I like, Helge's quote, is it was not like tons of work on my side. It's like a couple of hours of work, and it was really, well, quote, easy, I think that's what Helge said, to share my best practices. And it's great to see that these best practices are part of the book. This book and the PDF is created by these contributors, and it's really teamwork here. So you see the pictures of all the community friends, and I truly believe that without them we couldn't do this thing, and really want to say thanks to all the contributors. And I know for sure that quite some are on this call as well. So thank you very much. So the goal is to share best practices. That's what Helga, Nick, and I will do. But also, well, listen to your questions, see if we can answer your questions, or maybe if you want to share some of your best practices in a certain topic, just let us know. Happy to learn from you as well. So share your best practices, share them with us in the Q&A window in the GoToWebinar option. As I mentioned earlier, there are 14 topics or 14 categories in the book, in the guide. We just, quote, just have 1 hour. I'm sure we can fill up like a full day talking about best practices. Maybe we should do that somewhere in time, we'll see. But for now, for this webinar, we focus on 5 topics: server hardware, user environment management, guest OS optimization, remoting protocols, business and project lessons. So if you have questions or if you want to share your best practices around these 5 topics, please use the tools in GoToWebinar. If you have other best practices, I'm more than fine if you share them. We'll see if we can cover these at the end of the webinar. But if you have questions, when, for instance, Nick will start with server hardware best practices. If you have questions around server hardware best practices or want to share your best practices, let us know, and hopefully it will be a more lively conversation. Okay, I think that's it. Let's get started and use all the time we have with these 5 topics and best practices what we prepared and the questions you have with that. So Nick, let's open up the mic with this one.
Thanks, Ruben. I'm really excited to be a part of this initiative since it's a great way to crowdsource our best practices and keep them current. I think when things change as fast as they do in our industry, this is almost a necessity these days. Now, on to the best practices, and I'll first provide a bit more color on this one you see on the screen here. So Intel started shipping these new high core count Haswell EP chips about 1.5 years ago. Then they come in 14, 16, or 18 core flavors. And of course we have Skylake and even higher core counts these days. But beginning with Haswell EP, they slipped in a new advanced BIOS option to change how the cores are carved up and how something called snooping is done. Let me explain with an example. So say you have one of these 14 core chips. By default, those 14 cores aren't actually split into 2 even NUMA nodes or clusters. It's broken down into 6 and 8. And this uneven core segmentation presents some problems as it relates to carving up XenApp VMs, let's say on a hypervisor. So instead of going with a 6 vCPU spec to play it safe, or an 8 vCPU spec in which you'd pay a price as you cross cluster boundaries, I recommend enabling this cluster on die option in the BIOS to effectively instruct the box to steal a core from the 8-node cluster and present it to the 6-node cluster. This gives us 2 even 7-node clusters in each socket. And now we can safely configure 7 vCPU XenApp VMs, and this gives us a consistent config with the best performance. So you might be wondering, this theft comes at a price, right? It normally would, but not really in our case. The reason for this is because cluster on die is designed for highly NUMA optimized or aware workloads. And Windows VMs and all major hypervisors like vSphere or XenServer, they've been NUMA aware for a few years actually. So by changing the default snooping mechanism from early snoop, which is designed for any workload by the way, to cluster on die, we're trading remote memory latency for local memory bandwidth. And the latter is what we're after when we're talking about single server scalability in an RDSH-based deployment. As for the next best practice, perfect, thanks, about sizing the page file, this is one we continue to see messed up despite our best efforts the past 5 years or so. I encourage everyone to Google the page file done right if you haven't seen my article on this subject before. But if you remember one thing, it's don't size it based on some made-up multiple of RAM. It has nothing to do with that, even as Mark Rusinovich at Microsoft admits. It has everything to do with the peak commit of your workload. So size it according to how active your workload is and not equal to the size of physical memory or 1.5x RAM. Moving on to the next best practice on the next slide there, I couldn't agree more with Seth. 99% of all RDS or VDI workloads are CPU bound these days, and that's why we're constantly talking about CPU over subscription ratios, sizing based on cores, etc. It's always a balancing act, as Seth indicates here, but if there was something else I'd add, it would be to make sure you pick the right hardware for your workload. The goal is to ideally exhaust CPU, memory, disk, and networking resources at exactly the same time without breaking the bank. And the focus these days is on CPU and memory to a certain degree. And from my experience with the current hardware shipping these days, if I was doing an RDS-based deployment, I'd go with something like 2x12s, 14s, or 16s, and 256 to 384 gigs of RAM. And if I was doing VDI, I'd go with something like 2x12s, 14s, or 16s again, but with 512 to 768 gigs of RAM. Those are great sweet spots right now, in my opinion. Now I'll pass the torch to Helge, and I'll be back in a few minutes to talk through some more best practices.
Yeah, before we switch to like a different topic, from server hardware to UEM, I see one of the questions I see right now, and the option is there for you as well to ask questions to Nick or to Helge, to me, around server hardware. If you have questions, just let me know. One of the questions is what I got is, hey, in the BIOS there's like a setting to which quite often is the default is dynamic performance, and you can do static high performance. Do you know, is it a good thing, Nick, to change that, or do you want not change that and let the OS or the hypervisor control like CPU performance or performance in general?
Yeah, that's one where you got to think about what we're trying to, the goal, in an RDS-based environment is we're trying to maximize user density and really basically peg the CPU, at 80-90% comfortably. So we always want to enable that, high performance option in the BIOS, statically. I think we've been recommending that for the past 5 years or so, just to make sure that the CPU doesn't throttle anything. That'll give you the best performance. Yeah.
I had just a side note. I had attended a session last week at a VMware where one of the presenters talked about P states and C states and T states, and there's a lot of in-depth in these states. And what he mentioned is, what I recall is that if you set static high performance, that is indeed a simple best practice. But the CPU, I have a couple of turbo modes, and if you set this static high performance, turbo mode will be used, but just one block or one step in turbo mode, while the turbo mode has like 2 or 3 steps, and these will not be used when you use the static mode. So that was a learning thing for me as well. Well, we'll see if maybe we need to do some benchmarking and see what the real impact is for a particular desktop virtualization and application remoting workloads. But the simple step is indeed static high performance is the easiest way. And that's the same guy mentioned that like a large, I think 1200 physical server deployment, customer was complaining about quote lower performance or lower than he expected. And one of the things he didn't do was setting the BIOS correctly and setting the or in this case the vSphere environment correctly from this perspective. So this guy said, well, just change the BIOS settings, change the profile, make it static, and bam, and that's what we've seen in Project VRC. I think 15% performance increase just by, instead of going from dynamic to static. And that's well, that's also an interesting view. A lot of people know this setting, but sometimes you just forget, and you forget that this setting is important and will increase user density by 15 or sometimes 20% if you change the dynamic to static high performance setting in the BIOS. Okay, let's move on to topic number 2. Topic number 2 is all about UEM, user environment management, and as Helge explained in his bio, his background is a lot in UEM as an example. So the first best practice is for Helge.
Okay, so everybody wants fast logons, right? But nobody has them, kind of. Well, some people do, but the first difficulty is if I ask you what your logon time actually is, the duration of the average user logon, you have 2 difficulties. The first difficulty is that there is no standard way to measure the logon time. So there's no Windows event log or performance count or any other metric you can easily get to that tells you, okay, this user just logged on and his or her logon time was, let's say, 35 seconds. The second difficulty is, well, one user's logon time might be interesting if that specific user was complaining to the user help desk, for example, but typically you're interested in averages. And there's no way where the first thing, the difficulty is obviously getting to some kind of user logon duration, and the second is, let's say you manage to measure the logon duration for your many thousands of users. How do you perform statistical calculations? Like how do I get an average, or how do I see if things are improving or getting worse? Well, there are many different approaches to solving that problem and to answering these questions. Basically, the best practice here is don't run blind. In a default installation, you are basically more or less blind as to when it comes to user experience, and you need some way of figuring out what's actually going on, how fast or how slow your logons are, and a few other things too. Okay, so
jumping in here. So my observation is that everyone is blind almost. Like not so many people have, well, understand maybe this challenge or have the tools to do this, right? Not to be blind. Majority of people are blind in this space, is my experience.
Absolutely, yes.
Do you see the same, or do you see something else?
No, I must say many people, many organizations are kind of have a blind eye when it comes to user experience, and sometimes also to a little bit lesser extent to performance. So what's the utilization of the machines, how much are the different components like CPU, RAM, but also, for example, GPU utilized. Mm-hmm. It's not always trivial to find that out, and you do need some help. In other words, some tool or product that visualizes what's actually going on.
So when you saw this challenge, I think 4 years ago, that's how Uber Agent started, as an idea. Okay, how can I solve this, or is it something else?
Yes, well, when I was starting the development of Uber Agent, I was trying to answer questions that are otherwise difficult to answer. Like, for example, just deviating just a little bit from this topic, like measuring GPU utilization. Or the other thing regarding UEM, as I mentioned, there's no standard way to measure in a logon what the actual logon duration is. So you have to come up with some way which makes sense to people and which they can use in real life, and that is the kind of solution we try to offer.
Okay, well let's move on to the other best practice here.
Okay, yeah. Now, when users log on, SBC is of course always stateless. You don't want user state, in other words, profiles or other user settings lying around when after user has logged off. So basically, an SBC machine, when you boot it up, is clean. At least I hope they should be clean. And typically with VDI, that is also the case, at least with pooled VDI, in other words, non-persistent VDI. Mm-hmm. So in the instant the user logs on, you have to perform something pretty difficult. You have to transform that stateless, pristine operating system into a personalized environment where the user finds all their shortcuts, for example, all the applications, and many other things, and some of the data, obviously, too. So that is extremely difficult because obviously the user logon shouldn't take up too much time. So one of the traditional workarounds to make this seemingly impossible happen has been folder redirection. With folder redirection, you basically don't pull in a lot of data during the logon, but instead you're basically telling Windows, just fetch everything whenever you need it from a file server somewhere on my network. Now, what you're trading here is logon duration for constant load and a high dependency on the file server. Now, that generally is okay, but keep in mind that if the file server is slow, even for a period of just, let's say, just 30 seconds, that's more or less nothing. Most monitoring products don't even detect such a thing. But if a file server is slow during that time, users may experience that their start menu basically becomes unusable for that point in time, or applications kind of freeze. And those are the, well, kind of inexplicable things that cause users to well, that never get resolved. And that, so, any questions maybe on photo redirection, because that seems to be...
I had a question about, in the earlier days of Windows Server, like 2003 days, there were like limitations on like the amount of logs you could have on the SMB share. Is that still the case, or is it like so stretched, like no challenge over there on the file server side? So are there limitations on the file server side when you do folder redirection like this?
Well, with Server 2003, you have SMB1. Beginning with Server 2008, you have SMB2, which has many, many great and very important improvements. So anybody, if you're if you're running SMB in any way, please make absolutely sure that you actually have SMB at least version 2, or better yet version 3, because SMB version 1 has many, many limitations. Yeah. Do get off that, please.
Yeah. Okay, let's move to the other best practice, Helge.
Okay, so we've been hearing about user environment management. Microsoft has been pushing, well, has group policies. Then they, at some point in time, they bought a company which gave them the capability to what we today know as group policy preferences. They told us to not use Logon scripts anymore, use group policy and use preferences instead. And there are various vendors out there who have very good products that help with user environment management. Definitely. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with those products. Actually, some of them are awesome. But still, people are running Logon scripts. From what I see, most large organizations actually still use pretty complex Logon scripts. And well, that's okay if you have the people to manage it, to actually understand it. And that, unfortunately, is not always the case.
Or it's just one guy in the whole enterprise organization, and if he's on holiday or if he leaves, then everything like falls apart, is what I see.
Yes, that is extremely dangerous, a dangerous situation. I've seen, I've talked to people where they have a huge, very complex Logon script and they don't touch it. They basically just add tiny little, modify tiny little pieces because they fear everything breaks if they touch anything they don't really understand. Now the thing about that is, if you have such a monster you don't understand, you can't manage it, it probably it runs for way too long, delaying the user logon. So what you should do, you need to find out how long it actually runs and what component takes up how much time, and then you might find that you should optimize a few of the sections of that Logon script.
Hey, and why is PowerShell not a good thing in this context?
Oh, okay. Well, PowerShell is of course based on .NET, and .NET is kind of, it needs that runtime environment to execute, so it has a much higher resource, it needs much more system resources, which basically causes PowerShell Logon scripts to run a lot slower than other kinds of Logon scripts.
That's what I expect. Yeah, okay. This best practice is also an interesting one.
Yes, so maybe some of you guys have worked with WMI in the past, Windows Management Instrumentation. WMI is kind of an opaque data store Windows keeps somewhere, nobody really knows where, and you can, there's a query language, and you can formulate SQL-like queries in that query language, and the WMI data store will answer those. Now, there are a few problems with this, with WMI. One of those is that it's poorly documented, but another potential problem is that it can be very slow. And of course, you don't want any slowness during your user logon. Mm-hmm. So people, so WMI has a very bad reputation when it comes to using these kinds of queries during a group, in a group policy as a filter. Basically, the filter would then determine, would you use the filter to determine whether to apply a specific group policy object to this specific user or computer. Now, I made some measurements last year, and I found out that, interestingly, WMI filters are actually fast in this specific context. So it is generally okay to use WMI filters. It can be powerful. It can help you reduce the total number of GPOs you need pretty drastically, actually. There are just very few queries that are typically slow with WMI, and those are related to Win32 product, which you use to query the installed applications. But apart from that, WMI is actually good.
Okay. Hey, I received 2 questions in the context of UEM, and if you have other questions, just use the QA window, as some other people are doing as well. Well, what do you see as a normal login time in the enterprise, Helge, is one of the questions. What is an okay time?
Well, that's a very good one. Well, of course, the obvious answer is it depends, but let me elaborate a little bit. A login time I'm seeing pretty frequently, and that is considered okay by the companies that have it, is around 1 minute. So that is actually quite frequent in large organizations.
What do you mean large?
Like 500, 1,000 employees or more. Typically with that size, a lot of things everything is fully managed, and there are typically many different groups that want to control different aspects of the user experience, and complex things are happening during logon, and those complex things are definitely not good for user experience and logon performance. So a minute is something I see frequently. 30 seconds would, in my personal opinion, be pretty good for any real life organization. Anything below 30 seconds would be more or less spectacular, and 2 minutes is not at all unseen or unheard of.
Okay. Yeah, and this is actually something that I wrote an article about called like the rule of 30, I think, a couple months back. But 30 is kind of like my threshold. That's the goal, right? If I say kind of, if you're doing under 30, you're doing well for the most part, you know. And if you're over 30, something's probably not quite right. And unfortunately, like Helge, like I always see logon times way too long, and there's always something that can be optimized. So I routinely see them up in the 45-second to 1 minute range, as he was saying. But I think 30 is a good kind of benchmark and what everyone should be striving for.
Yeah. I received 2 questions, one from Bob and one from Patrick. From Bob, GPO/GPP, WMI filtering deadlocks with Citrix UPM, so we need to turn off the GPU refreshes. Any, quote, other workaround? Question?
I have to admit, I only half got that. Could you maybe repeat the question?
Yeah, of course. So GPO/GPP WMI filtering deadlocks with Citrix UPM. So we need to turn off the GPU refreshes.
Okay, so
that's what, I'm not sure that's a particular use case or more a generic thing he found, but that's the question Bob asked.
Well, he's probably referring to a group policy background refresh, which happens once the user is logged on, more or less every 90 minutes after the actual logon. Well, I have to admit I'm not aware of any potential deadlocks in relation to Citrix profile management. Maybe Nick has heard something?
No, not off the top of my head either.
Okay. Hey, Bob. Maybe you can send some more details about your question or what you see in the field. So ruben@atlantiscomputing.com, and I can take a look at that or forward it to Helge or Nick and see what we can find, or maybe use the Citrix CTP group and see if someone else has seen something specific in this case. some additional info from Bob. Each WMI filter was slowing down with 5 minutes the log-on time, is the feedback Bob said. Okay, Bob, send me an email, Bob, so that we can continue the conversation. Happy to do that. Patrick has another question. Does the GPP item targeting have impact on the speeds GPUs are applied? Does the GPP item targeting have impact on the speed?
Yes, he's referring to item level targeting. That's another way you can filter the policies that are applied to a specific user or computer. They are very powerful too. Of course, they affect the speed in similar manner as WMI, so a little bit, but actually the performance is quite good. What you should be aware of is that item level targeting works per item. So for example, if you want to, let's say, position 50 different icons on the user's desktop, depending on group membership, you will have to configure 50 different item level targeting entries. And so that every runtime of every single item level targeting query is basically multiplied by 50. In that simple example. So that can be something that, where WMI filters are actually a lot faster because you only have one WMI filter per GPO. I suggest if you want more information on that, I published a very extensive series of blog articles on helgeklein.com not too long ago.
Okay. And Bob said, hey, I have a Citrix ticket open with a case idea, so I'll forward it to Nick so he can take a look. With a smile on my face, but yeah, see what's it's already a case opened by Bob, talking earlier about his question. So okay, let's move on. I see another question popping in as well, but let's move on to Nick and Guest OS, and at the end, hopefully we'll have some extra time, or hopefully we'll have some time to answer questions like I think Michael asked. But I will want to proceed with this one, Guest OS. And Nick, this one is yours.
So yeah, this one here, and then maybe the next one you can show as well, since they're kind of related. But moving on to the Guest OS and talking about optimization and tuning, and you can't really talk about this stuff without talking about antivirus, everyone's favorite subject. So I mean, if you just plop on antivirus on an RDSH server and do nothing, I mean, we've seen performance hits, related to user density as high as 40 to 50%. So there's a reason that all the vendors out there and everyone publishing validated designs and reference architectures, there's no AV in a lot of those tests, and most of those tests. It's because the numbers, they don't look so good. Mm-hmm. So what we try to do here is strike a balance, right? I mean, I'm not saying disable antivirus is awful. It's all about finding adequate security and then putting some exclusions in place so you have good performance. And so, this is where there's been a lot of stuff published on this over the, what to exclude, what not to exclude. But we have our a link at the bottom there, the consolidated list of antivirus exclusions for what we believe, is kind of a nice balance that we've also kind of ran by some of the security folks at like McAfee and Symantec, for example. And then moving on to just optimizations in general, there's a ton of stuff out there, and as Patrick points out, like, the VMware OSOT tool, Citrix and desktop, we have a little target OS optimizer tool that used to be inside PVS. I mean, these are great tools that should not be kind of overlooked. If anybody was taking a look at Logon VSI's, one of their latest blog articles talking about, just applying a vanilla Windows 10 template and then looking at, Windows 10 plus VMware OSOT, it was a 44%, reduction or improvement in user density. I mean, that's amazing. You're talking about 144 VMs per host and 100 if you just do, with vanilla settings. And then Logon VSI took it a step further and squeezed out another 3.5%. So, once you're talking about 50% performance, reduction or gains, it's significant. So this is stuff that shouldn't be underestimated. And if you don't know where to start or haven't seen those tools before, the Citrix templates now that we've started shipping in the product a couple releases ago, like we have these things like high server scalability, and as Dan Feller illustrated, just turning that one on, which has a bunch of tweaks, underneath it, you can get 20%, improvement in user density right there, just by, literally, turning on that template. So it'll do everything for you. So some good stuff there.
Hey, with this connected to, I'll quote, one of my best practices is Yeah, it's great, and I know this space well. Together with Jeroen and other colleagues in the project VRC and team VRC context, we spent years and years, and we spent a lot of time in the past years finding the right best practices and squeezing all the performance out of the machines. But when you look at this best practice, like tuning your guest OS by disabling all the features, may sound great for IT professionals as well as we are on this call, squeezing out the performance of the machine. But well, it's not only about performance as well. It's also about, okay, what can I do with this stuff? And like simply disabling search is great from a performance perspective, but I cannot do my work, my daily work, without search on my machine, or my physical or virtual machine. So always keep that in mind. That yes, it makes sense if you tune the machine, and especially if you don't need the features in your image or in your environment, then you want to like get rid of these functions, especially if they have substantial impact on performance.
Yeah, you should question, what's in those templates, right? Ruben, your point.
Exactly. That's
yeah, you can't just blindly apply these things.
Yeah, exactly. Some of them are security related as well. So you could have an interesting conversation with your security officer if you disable certain features. So always question, okay, what is the impact of disabling features from a performance perspective? It's a great conversation, and there's a lot to gain on that side, as we know. But also on the other side, okay, what does this mean? What does this feature mean from a usability or a user experience perspective, or from a security perspective? And have that conversation with your colleagues as well.
Yeah, the search there, right, with the disabling the indexer is always a great example. And then on the security side, remember from back in the VRC initial days with ASLR? Yeah. So remember the address space layout randomization feature. It's a security feature, right, from Microsoft. And I think the very first test we were kind of recommending disabling it, and they were like, no, you can't do that. And so it's just one of those things that you probably don't ever want to disable. As it turns out, you have to live with it. So.
Yeah, but I also just opened a book on my desk right now. And it's, I think, coincidence, but the first, because one of my colleagues just structured the best practices. One of the first best practice from Andrew Morgan in the context server hardware is never ever trust performance benchmarks. We've all read the performance and sizing guidelines from Citrix, VMware, and all the hardware vendors promising 100,000 users on various type of hardware. It's crap. I like that statement. I understand where Andrew is coming from. Sometimes it was really crap. If you're able to run like 500 users on like on a simple machine, yeah, okay, what is the context of that? So always what I learned in VRC and consulting days. And you read these documents, even VRC or Atlantis or like other vendor documents, what is the context of that info? What kind of benchmarking is being used? What kind of application being used? And always try to understand, okay, this is the context. And my context, like my company context or the company where I'm consulting, is a different context. So don't apply the same numbers to your environment. Is also a best practice, a little bit sidetracked, but that's what I also want to emphasize in benchmarking in general. Let's move on to Helge and his best practice.
Yeah, that last one is a very important one. I'd like to I fully agree with that. But moving on to this next best practice, one of the many myths around Windows and potentially computing in general is, well, end-user computing at least, is people tend to feel that over time their machines get slower. Well, is that true? Yes or no? Well, one thing I'd like to say first is that an operating system like Windows, it ages really well from a UX perspective, potentially not from a security perspective. So Windows XP is definitely not cool anymore, but generally the performance of a system doesn't degrade just all by itself without any further changes. But changes are happening all the time. People install new applications. Applications become bigger. Office 2016 is probably a little bit needs more resources than 2007 for example. And at the same time, you have this shiny new VI box. At the beginning, you maybe start with just making up a number, 30 VMs on that. But then more people want VDI machines, and management doesn't give you the money to buy a second server just for that one new additional VM, so you squeeze another VM on the box, and another one, and another one. And what happens, of course, all the other VMs that already are on that machine, they get slower and slower. That basically is why Windows and other operating systems in a similar space become slower over time.
Good. There are some questions. See how we're doing on time. Like 15-ish minutes left until the hour, and I think 2 topics as well left. So I think we are okay. Pick a couple of questions here. One to Helge. This one was in the UEM context. Did you fix the office problem during Logon you were talking about at Briforum? Seems to be a nice scenario to troubleshoot real-life problems besides the best practices we hear about right now. So did you fix the office problem during Logon?
Well, that's catching me off guard. I know I was in London for Briforum just recently, but in between that I was in 7 or 8 days in Las Vegas for Synergy and E3VC, and I've spoken to hundreds of people. I'm sorry, I need more information. Please forward your question to Ruben, and I'll try to answer by email.
Exactly. That's one to Michael. And Bob, I think you're on the call. You shared a lot of great info on the QA. Please copy paste that in an email as well. But because when I go to webinar, I will not see QA. It is recorded somewhere in the reports. But please send me an email. That's much easier with the content you have. Ruben@atlantiscomputing.com. That would be much handier. Other topic, Andy Paul asked, do you recommend using the VMware OS optimization tool as well? The answer is yes. It's a very simple, nice looking and good tool as well. As Nick mentioned, it's a great tool, but also always understand, okay, what is the tool doing in the background if you disable certain things, and what does it mean for performance? Great topic. But also what does it mean from a usability and security perspective if you disable, well, feature X or function A, these type of things. One of the best practices, I think Hazen mentioned that, is like disabling 8.5 notation, which is actually a Citrix best practice, but this breaks a lot as well, is what Hazen, it's not really a question, but more feedback from Hazen. Do you see that, Nick, or Helge in the field? So the 8.3 notation, I think it's related to NTFS.
Yeah, I've seen that pop up a couple times.
Well, from my experience, that doesn't improve speed at all. So disabling 8.3 doesn't improve the machine's speed. So just leave it the way it is. My recommendation.
Yeah, if it doesn't improve and you potentially could break stuff, just keep it what it is. Okay, that's an interesting one. Okay, let's move to remoting protocols, and this was more like a sort of introduction to what Nick is. Well, Nick's his topic, and Nick and Dan had a very interesting session at Briforum. If you're if you're able to attend Briforum US, I'm not sure if they will present there, but I assume they are, and otherwise it's great to find a recording somewhere in time of the Briforum UK session about remoting protocols, the impact on scalability. But my point here is understand the benefits, so find out content. I think Nick wrote a blog post this week or last week about this topic with all its key findings. That's a very interesting blog post. The core is that there are a lot of options in the different remoting protocol options in ICA HCX, which has impact in user experience, but also impact on like CPU, bandwidth scenarios. With the addition, when you add GPOs and H.264 encoders on the die, on the chip, that's also a new segue in this newer remoting protocols like Blast Extreme from VMware as an example, or H.264 optimized remoting protocols on Citrix. So it's almost like a complete. You can almost fill fill a complete webinar about this, and that's what Nick and Dan did at Briforum, and it's a very interesting topic to understand. A couple of community friends created a remote display analyzer. I think it's rdanalyzer.com or something like that. Barry is one of the community friends here. So it's a good topic to understand the different remoting protocols, the options in the remoting protocols, and the impact also to the GPU side. And maybe Nick can jump in briefly on that one if you're talking about
Yeah, and actually that if you want all the gory details from that Briform session that we did on protocols and codecs, I published it earlier this week on Citrix blog, so you can download the full PowerPoint and check it out. But this is kind of a little Citrix specific, and I'll talk about VMware in a minute. But I guess if there's one big takeaway, if you're using older Microsoft platforms, what they call legacy Microsoft platforms, so things like Windows 7, 2008 R2, and we call them legacy because they're built on GDI, GDI+, and that's what legacy ThinWire, what we call legacy graphics sometimes, it was optimized right for those legacy, for GDI and GDI+. So if you're still using those, make sure to flip to, toggle a switch and enable legacy ThinWire. But for anything newer, so the newer operating systems, right, the modern, as Microsoft calls them, so 2012 R2, Windows 10, right, and I have some news to share actually on this one. The default up to this point had been ThinWire H.264, so basically the H.264 codec. But I've been recommending and screaming from the mountaintops over the last year or so to enable what we call ThinWire non-H.264, or ThinWire Plus informally is what we call it. But as of 7.9, when we shipped it last week, we actually switched our default codec, which is fantastic. So now, basically what we did was we switched it from H.264 to this ThinWire Plus. So if you're not on 7.9, you're still going to need to flip it, but you're going to squeeze out a bunch more, performance gains and improvements in terms of user density if you use that ThinWire non-H.264, which is probably good and suitable for about 90% of the apps and use cases. So, yeah.
So I just copied the link to the blog post Nick wrote in the chat window. So if you're if you have the ability to open up the chat window, and you'll see the URL to the blog post. If not, let me know, or let Nick know if you want more insight in that topic. I found it very, very interesting session. I learned a lot. Yeah, so it's good to read that blog post, and it's not only applicable to Citrix, although Nick works for Citrix, but the investigation he did together with Dan was Citrix and VMware, different codecs.
Yeah, and good point. I forgot to mention that. I mean, like Blast has the option. Right now people are like, oh, Blast, that's one thing. Blast has 4 variations as well. So Blast comes in the flavors of TCP or UDP, and you can also do H.264, basically JPEG or non-H.264. So you got to understand kind of what each of these are trying to do, because they're all designed with different things in mind, right?
Yeah. Good. So let's. I think we have 10 minutes left, so we're doing great. Let's move on to the 5th topic, business and project lessons. And if we finish that on time, I think we have some time for QA as well. I think there's quite some feedback already, and we're doing great so far. So awesome. Let's go to this topic, business and project lessons. Helge, this one is yours.
Yeah, I didn't see the slide switch yet. That's why I was waiting. Okay, basically the first question any manager asks when a new project, VDI or SBC project is starting is, well, how many servers do we need to buy? Well, the obvious answer again, it depends, but that's not quite good enough. You need to buy a certain finite set of servers, and you need to somehow figure out how many. Well, one of the seemingly the most logical approach to answering that question is, well, let's somehow measure the average footprint of the average session. And for example, if we find out that the average IOPS requirement per session is, let's say, making anything up here, 35. So every user generates on average 35 disk IOs per second. So we can multiply that by the number of users, and we immediately know how to size the disk subsystem. Right? Wrong. obviously, because that is just the average. You will have a sustained period of higher activity, if not only during the user log on, but even during normal business hours, and you need to cater for that. So at the same time, you shouldn't size for the one single peak you might have for just maybe 20 seconds in 24 hours. That would, on the other hand, be wasting money, throwing money away for performance you don't need. So what we recommend is that you size for something we call peak average performance utilization. That is kind of taking the out of these average values kind of a peak and size based on that. That combines good user experience with affordable pricing. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Let's move to this one. Stop relying on end users as monitors in the desk virtualization environment. Use tools. There are tools, and there are more and more like really good tools as well in this space. End-to-end performance management tools available to use. Quite often people see that as sort of afterthought. In my experience, it is a good practice to add these tools as part of the design itself, and not like as an afterthought. Also, another good practice or best practice is to connect the like IT support or the help desk guys pretty close to the like IT professional designing the stuff, especially when you have like multiple floors in the location. As an example, like help desk, service desk is in the 6th floor, and like the IT guys who are designing are on the 1st floor. Sometimes it's great if they are on the same floor, so the guys who are designing and building and maintaining their environments are really close to these services. So if something pops up, they see the impact of the stuff they do or the stuff they did as another best practice. So finding the right tools. I think Andy Morgan has Andy, I think Jim and Andrew had a couple of sessions also at Bribe Forum where they talked about different tools, and UberAgent is one of them. Control Hub is a good one as well, is what I see. EG Innovations is a good one. There's a ton of good tools in this space, which can be helpful or more than helpful, actually mandatory in this type of solution, this type of environment. Let's see, there are 5 minutes left. Just use QA to ask questions in these 5 different topics, or even if you have other best practices or want to share best practices, or if you have questions in other topics, let us know. Attendance rate is good. That's a very good sign. So Nick and Helga, you're doing really great. That's a very good sign. People are really listening to us and are engaged. That's a good one. Yeah, just thank you. That's a good one as well. Thanks, Todd and Bruce. Yeah, I think what I mentioned earlier is there will be new, or this best practice guide is new. It's just released 2 or 3 weeks ago, but there will be additional best practices guides being created over time. If you want to be part of this community, it's not a ton of work, as Helga shared earlier with me, and my own experience as well. It's like I wrote, I think, 20-25 best practices. That took me, I don't know, like a day-ish, something like that. So it's not a ton of work, and especially when you just share 3, 4, 5 best practices, are still very valuable. Are very valuable for this group. So if you want to be part of this community effort, let me know, and we'll see when an updated version or a new version or maybe a deep dive on a certain topic. Best practice guides will be created, and I'm more than happy to help you with that and to support you with that. Let's see. One other topic is about IOPS, probably for Nick is the same one. What do you see, Nick, as a good storage IOP number in the VDI space? What's a good number to calculate with?
Well, that changed dramatically, right? Once we, for us at least, once we introduced the PVS RAM cache with overflow disk. Because I mean, before we were saying, Helge just talked about average, so I'm going to say it, but let's just to keep things simple, a Windows 7 VM, right, was generating, let's say, 20 average IOPS. Once we slapped the PVS RAM cache with overflow to disk on that and put in a 512 meg buffer, for example, all of a sudden the only IOPS we were seeing was 1 or 2. So we totally changed the game with that, and MCS, with 7.9 actually has the same ability to, basically to use non-page pool memory to cache, a lot of the I/O before it spits anything out the disk. So the numbers we were using, a year or two ago are totally different today.
That makes total sense. And stateful is tougher.
Right.
Yeah, and like 20, 30, 50 IOPS seems like a lot, but when you look at your local drive, like spinning drive, is like 70-ish IOPS already. So don't size with like 3, 4, 5, 7, 8 IOPS. That will take ages before things will start or things will do. 50, 100 IOPS is not a strange number to use in your calculation. And then depending on what kind of technology are you using, like PVS and RAM and overflow to disk as an example, or other solutions like XLAN as an example, will solve the whole storage and IOP conversation for stateless, stateful, XenApps and desktop Horizon View type of scenario. So.
Yeah, I mean that's what I was going to add too. Is like because of these things like PVS and MCS, these RAM caching features, and things like Atlantis and Nutanix and a slew of other technologies. I'm not talking about IOPS a whole lot anymore. I feel like we've solved that a couple of years ago. We're starting to move on. It's back to CPU being the bottleneck, as I said earlier. That's really the number one focus for me.
Probably will open up this interesting one. So would you recommend SSD or SAS 15K for VDI? That's Peter asking.
Both. How about that? Hybrid, it's all the rage these days, right?
Why both and not just SSD?
Well, I mean, it's a balancing act, right? Like it's like a heat map. I think is a good way to always describe it. It's for the stuff that really requires, the high storage throughput. Sure, serve it by SSD. But for the stuff that's non-mission critical or doesn't require it, put it on a lower, SAS disk or SATA disk. And combining those things with hybrid storage, right? That's what gives you the best bang for your buck.
Mm-hmm.
So you got to understand the I/O profile, right, of your workload, and then size and buy accordingly. I just don't like to answer the question like, is SSD good or bad? It's like, well, what for what?
Yeah, there's a price tag in that as well, and like it's much bigger story. Bob had a question: how to take advantage of the MCS improvement in 7.9 when you're running LTSR? I can answer that question. Probably cannot take advantage because of 7.9 because, well, you choose to be LTSR, and with LTSR it means, okay, this is like the long-term supported release, and with that certain versions of, for instance, PVS or XenDesktop are part of that LTSR release. So,
yeah, exactly. I mean, you basically today you choose 7.9 current release.
7.9. But yeah, you choose, or the customer choose to go to LTSR, long-term supported release, and with that it means like, okay, you don't switch PVS in that stack. It's like a complete stack which is supported, is what I see.
Yeah, that's spot on. And I'll just add that you have to wait for the next release, but it's not like we're sitting on LTSR. Like a lot of people don't know, we just, along with 7.9, we shipped 7.6 CU1, so the first LTSR cumulative update. So we slipped that in last week as well, and that has 330 bug fixes. And then we're not going to just sit and say that 7.6 is the LTSR release for the next 10 years. It doesn't work like that. I fully expect in a short amount of time there'll be a next release of Citrix that will be LTSR, the next release of LTSR, and then you can take advantage of that MCS I/O optimization there.
Yep. I think we run out of time. There are like a couple of questions left. See if we can answer this question from Peter. Do you recommend ATI or NVIDIA GPU for 3D rendering? Is a question. Probably meant AMD, but I get the point. Well, it depends. AMD has a couple of great FirePro GPU boards, but what I see in the field and my own experience is that NVIDIA is leading this spec, like as we speak, with grid, vGPU options, quality assurance, supportability from an application perspective, from an ISV perspective, from a hardware vendor perspective. But that being said, that AMD and also Intel with RS Pro and GVTX are stepping up, which is a very good thing for us, like us as Atlantis or Peter as maybe a consultant. I don't know Peter, but as an example, competition is good. So AMD, Intel, NVIDIA, more competition is good for us. Price lower, better solutions, more choice is always a good thing. My general answer would be like NVIDIA right now is leading, so my answer will be NVIDIA, but it also depends on context. So as an example, like AMD Fire Pro in a shared mode with Zenab, it's what I see as well. But again, hardware support, application support are also part of the conversation, not only about like, hey, which hardware is the best, or which hardware is the cheapest, or which hardware is the most performance. It's also the software stack, software part of that. Yeah, I think it's good to close the Q&A as well. There are a lot of great questions, but yeah, we could fill in a complete new webinar with new topics and new questions. Download the guide at atlantiscomputing.com/VDI guide. I mentioned it like twice or 3 times. If you want to contribute and join a team, it's not a ton of work. It's fun. It's a learning experience. Send me an email, ruben@atlantiscomputing.com, and we'll share more and more best practices via social media and Twitter in particular as well, using VDI guide or #VDI guide. And there will be a new webinar planned probably after my summer holiday with new topics. We picked 5 of these topics. We'll use other topics, other themes in a new webinar, so stay tuned at Atlantis SDS, or if you are interested, send me an email and I will inform you as well. I think with that, a big thanks for Helge and for Nick and their insights. For you guys as well, the attendees, for your questions, and it's great to see a lot of people like the content. A lot of thanks and awesome content. It's always great to hear. So thank you very much, and I think have a great morning, have a great afternoon, or have a great evening, depending on where you are. Thank you very much, and have a great day.